welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Ahmed and
Eric Olson.
All right. Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Westin MCAT podcast. Ahmed and Eric here, and today we're going to be talking about interviews. And so I have just completed, I assume, maybe a potential couple interviews remaining, but for the most part, completed an interview cycle. Eric has since long completed his med school interview cycle, and we figured for those of you who are curious, for those of you who are about to apply to med school, it could be an awesome opportunity to talk about what that interview experience is like, what Eric has found to be successful, what sorts of things I've experienced, and maybe we compare and contrast a little bit how the med school interview has evolved from a pre and post COVID era. And so, Eric, obviously you interviewed pre-COVID, would have been late 2010s.
Yeah, it was, I guess it was like late 2018, early 2019. I think, yeah, because I finished college in 2019 and started medical school the same year.
Right. And so you were interviewing in the ancient era of in-person med school interviews.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you say it was pre-COVID, because at the time, when I think about that time in my life, I don't separate it by pre or post-COVID. It was just like, I'm just doing medical school interviews, but now we have to put everything in context of COVID, so it's kind of funny. Yeah, it was all in person, a lot of flying around, a lot of like wearing the same suit to all my interviews and trying to pick out a tie that I thought people would like. I went to a state school and I would wear the state school colors. And actually, you're not asking, but I did go to a non-state school for an interview. It was like, not a place with the big sports program or anything. But I was inadvertently wearing colors of the rival school from the program direct. The individual who was interviewing me, I put it in terms of program director because that's how I think of it in residency interviews. But yeah, I went into this interview and they're like, "Oh, you're wearing these colors. Like, I can't believe you'd wear something like that." And so it mattered a lot. I guess you still have the same thing with Zoom interviews, but yeah.
Did you end up getting into that school?
I did not. I hope that didn't play into it, but you never know.
It's funny though. I subconsciously sort of thought the same things as I was going through this interview cycle. I interviewed at a school that had purple as their primary color. I wore a purple dress shirt, and school with red as their primary color, red tie. And so you
got to show some interest,
Yeah. And I think it's subtle, but it I don't know. I think it's a gesture. And granted, I didn't go out and buy any of these items. These were things I already had.
Yeah.
Would I justify spending, $50 on a dress shirt to match the color of the school I'm applying to? Nah,
depends on how much money you have, I think. Do you have $50 to blow? If so, then maybe. But
I think even if I did, there's some colors where I'm probably not wearing that dress shirt again. Purple being a prime example. I just happen to have it because it was a hand-me-down from my dad. But if I didn't have it, no chance I was going out and buying one. Now, granted, I could buy a purple tie because I think ties are a little bit cheaper than dress shirts anyway. But I think white dress shirt, purple tie could have looked pretty sleek. But
it's easy from kind of a male perspective. All you have to do is wear the white dress shirt and whatever tie that you want. From a female perspective, I don't know if I can really speak to it, but it seems like it might be a little bit harder to match the sentiment of the school.
100%. I think
so. Go ahead.
Male interview apparel, like you said, it's just swapping out the tie. And I'm no expert in female formal fashion. Say that 10 times fast, but definitely more difficult. But in terms of flying around the country, for me, I always enjoyed traveling for conferences and stuff because I felt like I was a big deal. definitely was
Yeah.
not. But like, you just get this feeling of like, I'm flying across the country with a purpose, right?
Yeah.
And what was that like for you?
Yeah. I mean, it's different from my perspective from a conference for a few reasons. And one is because I haven't been to too many conferences. I'll start off with that. But the few that I have, I've had some sort of funding. Like
Right.
either I got a grant from the conference itself, or my program or my school was giving me some money to go. And so I kind of felt like I was getting away with something, because I was doing it on someone else's dime.
Right.
Whereas with the medical school interviews, again, you're paying for it all. And so it's and I didn't have very much money, and I was cheap, as I think I alluded to on our last call. So I was like, what's the red eye? Like, what's the absolute cheapest I can do? I don't
Right.
need a bag. I'll just wear my suit on the plane, and then I'll just get off and do the interview, and then I'll get back on the plane in the suit still. You know what I mean? It was not a pretty time. It's kind of fun to go and see those places. And I took my wife to a couple of those interviews just for fun, to kind of do something, because you want to enjoy it, and kind
Right.
of make the most of the, you know, the opportunity to go to these different places.
100%.
Um, but at the same time, my experience was maybe a little bit different from most people's experiences at the time, in that I was a traditional applicant, and so I was still in school at the time, and I had kind of finagled my schedule because I had hoped that I would be interviewing during my senior year, and so I had left some of the easier classes to the end, right? So it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but again, the trying to not be out of school and making sure I was back in back at university for the important times, trying to save as much money as possible. It was, there was some self-importance going on that was kind of fun, like feeling like
Right.
I was doing something important, and I had gotten all these interviews, and it was a trophy for me. But I think the stress and the expense and all those things, I think that kind of outweighed the fun of it for me, which is unfortunate. I think if you were not in school, I mean, you'd probably have a job. I guess I can't really speak to that, but I hope that people had more fun on the interview trail during that time than I did, because it was a pretty stressful time. And
And
of
yeah,
course, you're going into these interviews, and you've been to these interviews, you're just thinking about all the ways that can go wrong, and trying to remember all the things that you put on your resume and how you answered the essay questions and all these things.
yeah,
They can ask you about anything. And so there's a lot going on in your head that can be hard to deal with.
right. And I think even there, like, things have changed now where obviously I've done all of my interviews online. So there's been no expense, there's been no travel. And I think, I optimally have it that way. I'm in a gap year, so I don't have the school element to worry about. I'm fortunate enough to be working here at Jack Weston, where I've got a ton of flexibility. And
But a
so
ton of responsibility too, right? And
that's
you're
true.
busy
That
with
is true.
all of those things.
I think if I were to put myself in your shoes, I would have liked to go, and obviously, this wouldn't have been something in my power, but like if I took all of my interviews, I would have liked to go to like maybe half of them. Some of them, I'm more than happy to do them virtually.
Yeah.
Some of them though, I think it would have been cool. Like, obviously I'm working, and I don't want to fly to all of these places for the same reason you mentioned from an expense standpoint, but I think it'd be cool to go to a handful of these places and just like check out the school, check out the city, check out, and just like that feeling of, like I said earlier, just traveling with a purpose. But I think,
It is interesting. Sorry to butt in, but I just
no,
have to say, it is interesting. You get so much more. As someone who did the in-person interviewing and then did virtual interviewing as I did residency interviews, you just don't really get a vibe when you're doing the virtual interviews, and that's part of the detriment. I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it opens it up to people who might not have the financial means to be able to do as much traveling and things like that.
right.
But you really just don't get as much of a feel and a flavor for what a place is like um,
Yeah.
with the virtual interviewing as you would with in person. And it's interesting now, and I don't know what the medical school landscape looks like, But for residency interviews this last year, um, programs were encouraged not to give you the option of either doing a virtual interview or doing an in-person interview because it introduces some bias, right? You meet someone in person, it's different from meeting someone online. And so those people may or may have an advantage or disadvantage depending on, how they do. But
Right.
I did have a couple of programs that said, oh, you can come in person or you could do virtual. And I went both ways on some of those, just like you're saying, some of them I went to in person and some of them I did virtually. And it is definitely a very different experience. I find myself wondering, and I wondered in this last year, what's going to happen with that moving forward. So were all of your interviews, I'm guessing you didn't have the option to do anything in person?
Didn't have the option to do anything in person. And even with the virtual interviews, 3 different formats. One of them was completely async. So I didn't speak to anyone. I just spoke to the camera, given the prompt. And that one I had, it was 2 minutes of prep time. You had 5 minutes to answer the main prompt, and then you were given 20 seconds to prep for a follow-up, to which you had 3 minutes to respond. And prepping for the follow-up was tough because some of them required a decent amount of thought, but you get 20 seconds and it's like, well, you build off of what you said in the main prompt, but they weren't always the most integrated, we'll say.
Sure.
And so that was one type that I had. Most of them were, and they're all basically MMI based. Some schools I know have very traditional open file, single person interview for an hour. A friend of mine interviewed at a school where he had an interview for an hour with a student and then an interview for an hour with a faculty member on different days. And it was just open file discussion type of thing. I didn't have
interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. For me personally, I was, my friend and I chatted about this. I think I perform better in an MMI setting because I view that as I have more opportunities to sort of recruit advocates for my application, so to speak.
Sure.
And so even within the MMIs that I had, different formats. One of them was purely MMI where I'm trying to remember how many stations there were. I think 8, 2 of which were rest stations. And so I had 6 active stations. And but they were all MMI, all closed file.
Sorry, but before you continue, just because I think probably most people are familiar with this, but some people may be kind of listening and just starting to get into the application to medical school space. So can you kind of tell us about what MMI is, what that means?
Yeah.
It's like.
And so appreciate you pointing that out, Eric. The MMI stands for multiple mini interview. And so as the name suggests, there's multiple stations and they're mini interviews rather than those long, panel or one-off, single individual hour-long interviews that I had mentioned a friend of mine had earlier. And so it's like the speed dating of the med school process where, you interact with lots of different interviewers and you get lots of different scenarios and prompts and, you do your best to respond to each of them. And even within the MMIs that I had, different formats. So one I had that I was just mentioning was all just, your typical MMI stations. Another one I had was 10 stations as opposed to 8. The stations were also longer. I think these ones were 10 minutes instead of 8 minutes. And so that interview block ended up taking 2 hours as opposed to an hour 15 or so. And that one actually had a traditional component embedded within it. And so one of those 10 stations was, a traditional open file interview. So this was a 20-minute station. And so you've got somebody who has your application open. In this particular case, I actually didn't get asked a lot about points on my application. It was more sort of, why medicine, why us type of thing. But what I learned, in this interview prep process is when you get those traditional interviews, you need to keep in mind these people interviewing you are indeed your advocates. They're not looking for reasons to keep you out. They're looking for strengths of yours to go present to the admissions committee. And so, even if you have somebody who does a good job at masking their emotions, right? Because these are people who are trained not to respond one way or another. Now, granted, occasionally you might get a smile out of somebody. And I actually, ironically enough, I had an interviewer verbatim say, "Oh, I like that," to one of my answers. And I was like, "Oh, cool. I'm glad you like it." And he even said, I probably shouldn't have said that. And I'm like, "Hey, all good. Secret safe." But
except for on this podcast that you're talking
hey, John
but no
Doe,
names. Yeah.
John Doe from University X. Honestly, I don't even remember the gentleman's name, but it's for me, like I was saying, I appreciate the MMI environment because it gives me more opportunities to interact with people. And for me, I'm always of the mindset, and I've become comfortable socially just through experience. Whether that was playing sports in college or working with different companies and different age groups and things like that. And even as a kid, I was always a talkative kid, and I had to be told to be quiet, so I was never the shy one or anything. Yeah, so for me, being able to interact with multiple interviewers, I always felt was to my advantage, and
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, obviously the results of these interviews are still pending. So
Sure.
I'll get back to you guys with how they went. But it's interesting to see how the interview landscape has changed. And I know for me, and I know you can speak to this as well, Eric, but like our prep probably varied slightly. Like for me, a lot of these interviews I knew going into them were going to be closed file. And so I didn't refer back to my primary or secondary applications like at all for most of them. A handful were either fully or partially open file. And in those cases, obviously, you got to go back and make sure that, and granted, this shouldn't take a lot of time because if you were truthful on your application, a lot of this stuff comes organically, but you go back and you revisit, when did I start here? When did I finish here? How many hours did I commit to this? Who are my reference letters? Things like that. But honestly, for me, the ones that I had to review more were the secondary application. Like, what did I say specific to this school that I can build on in an interview? But I'm curious, of your interviews, Eric, were most of them open file?
Yeah, they were. We did have some MMIs, and I think we were kind of trending in that direction at that time, 5 years ago. But I think most of them were open file. And I had a similar experience actually to what you kind of alluded to previously, which was that I would study my application, and I can think of one particular experience that I had. I lived in Brazil for a couple of years. I was a missionary, and so I learned to speak Portuguese.
Oh, cool.
And it was on my application. I was fluent in Portuguese, and I was pretty recently back from Brazil at that time. Within a couple of years, 2-3 years, and so my Portuguese was still pretty good. And it's okay right now. It's still okay. But I was ready to speak Portuguese with people if they wanted to. And I remember one of these flights that it was a red-eye flight, and I rolled into this university in the morning without having gotten any sleep, and I hadn't reviewed my application. And the individual came into the room and started speaking Portuguese to me, and I was like, just kind of disoriented and caught off guard.
Right.
And I really hesitated, and then she shifted to English. And I think she took that as like, this is a lie, like this guy doesn't actually speak Portuguese. And I was,
Right.
At that point I was really flabbergasted, and I think I did not do particularly well in that interview. And it kind of speaks to the importance of knowing your file. And again, that was something that I knew about myself. Obviously, I could speak the language, but sometimes those things will come up. I would say, similar to what you said, that even in those open file interviews, it was my experience that most of the time they aren't grilling you on, the little details of your application. I felt like a lot of the advice that I got was like, if you're going to put, a research item down, if you're going to put a presentation that you did, or, a volunteer activity that you did, you need to know, like, what was it? When did you do it? What were the activities involved? What did you learn from that experience? How is it going to make you a better doctor? And kind of have not canned answers for all of those things, but at least have given it some thought. But I similarly found that most of the questions that I got, and it's not all of the questions that I got, but many were more. There was a lot more conversation, a lot less. I'm your interviewer, and here are the questions that I have for you to answer. I think that happens at some institutions and with some particular interviewers. I think there's a lot of variability between interviewers, but I think for the most part, they wanted to, like you said, why are you interested in medicine? Why are you coming to this institution? What do you like about our program? Tell me about yourself. Very open-ended, like just wanting to get to know you a little bit, and trying to find ways to be your advocate, just as you're saying. And so, while there is certainly a lot of room for preparation and a lot of things, I think we'll talk a little bit later about some insights that we have and thoughts that we have about how to prepare for interviews. But I think at the end of the day, open or closed file, a lot of it is just trying to get to know you and trying to determine if you're a good fit, if you're a good person, they would want to spend the day with you. You know what I mean?
100%. And I think on the note of, sometimes canned questions, I remember clearly one of the stations at one of the interviews, I had this cycle, you could feel like, this individual was just rattling questions off a list. And I was like, I really hope you because for me, when I'm answering questions, there's times where I'm like, oh, if this person pokes at this a little bit more, I can go in this direction and perfect. And sometimes it happens and I'm like, oh man, I'm so happy you asked that question. Let's talk. And there's other times where you can tell they have a script that they're sticking to. And it's interesting, like you said, the variation between interviewers is not super disruptive by any means, but it's interesting in hindsight where sometimes you've got interviewers where it seems so comfortable. And there's times where if you're not experienced, it can be misconstrued as, oh, this person doesn't like me. When really they're just a stoic person, right? They're not, and as they should be, they're not very reactive, we'll say. And I think, especially if you haven't done an interview before, you can really take that the wrong way. And sort of alluding back to your point, the Portuguese speaking interviewer, sometimes, if you feel like you're behind the 8 ball early on in an interview, it's easy to let that snowball, especially, in your era when it was in person, right? At least for us now, you're not in a room, you're not around other people. When you're in that break, nobody can see you, right? So you can really gather yourself. And
you're still in your own space, even if you're not in your own house, you're in some sort of place that is familiar to you and some fact.
Exactly.
Right. And it's very different from, being in a different city, walking into a different building. You're not on your home turf. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so even just being in that environment, I think, at least in my experience, having done it at home and having done it at the away stadium, so to speak. There's a home field advantage, I think.
Absolutely. And I tell students this all the time, even with respect to the MCAT, right? It's natural, especially if you're a first time taker, for your score to go down, because you just, no matter how hard you try, you can't simulate that MCAT environment, right? You got a palm scan, you got to get patted down. They inspect your glasses like you're James Bond, and they don't mess around. But I was curious, throughout the interview experience, Eric, did you have any cool sort of quirky mini experiences, so to speak? Was there anything that a school did that you were like, oh, that's pretty cool? For me, I had a school give out DoorDash gift cards, as you treat yourself to lunch on interview day. It's oh my goodness, if I get in, this is my top choice.
This is the spot.
A gift card. Not not necessarily, but just the gesture, right? Hey, we want you guys to interview here. We want you guys to feel sort of welcomed. Whereas, another school I interviewed at, it was like very cut and dry. Like, this is your interview date. There will be zero accommodations. Like, we didn't get to choose when you interviewed. This is the date, this is the time. If you've got a conflict, figure it out. And it's like just two opposite ends of the spectrum of, we'll say, hospitality pre-interview. I was curious if you had any similar experiences to both sides.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting, it is an interesting question. It's not something I'd really thought about because I can think of one program that I went to that did seem genuinely excited that we were there. And again, I think it's changed from the in-person to the post-COVID video interviewing. We had one program that gave us, while we were there, gave us like a little bag with some stuff, a swag bag, I think they called it, and it had, some branded goodies, and it had some food and something local, you know what I mean? And so that was fun. It was like, wow, they put some effort into this. Like, they're exactly like you said, they're excited that we're here. And I had another similar to your experience that they brought us in and they gave us like a 5-minute intro at the beginning. And then they were like, here's a map of the school and your interview times are on the back and we'll see you there at those times. And it was like, it was like 7:30 a.m. And it was like, oh, your interview is like on the other side of the city, like in this other building across campus at 10:45. And like, good luck finding something to do between now and then. You know what I mean? So that was a little bit of a turn off. Like, okay, these people didn't really put any, or maybe they put thought into it and maybe the resources weren't there. I don't know what the situation was, but it was definitely less of a warm welcome. And, similarly in the video interviewing era, there were a couple of, I don't know what happens, with medical school interviews right now and what they're doing. I do know that for some of the residency programs that I interviewed for, not many of them, but some of them had things that they would send in the mail, and it was not anything big, but it was like, oh, a notebook or some stickers or just something silly. But again, it's the gesture and it makes a difference. And it's kind of funny because it's probably pretty low budget and they do it for everyone that interviews there. So it's not like a personal, oh, Ahmed, like, you're so great, we're sending you this notebook, but just the fact that they do something for you at all it makes a difference in the way that you're viewing the program. And so
I'm not gonna lie, as soon as I got the email with the gift card, I immediately went online. I was like, did other people get this?
Oh yeah. Was I the only one?
The surprise of no one at all, I was not the only one. But no, I agree 100%. Like, I think just something that makes you feel comfortable going into test day, something that immediately gives you positive associations with the school that you're applying at. And it just, there's something to be said for a school that's proactive and saying, hey, like, we want you here, like, you're here for a reason. And, and at least for me, minus a couple, pretty much every interview that I had was a full day experience, and that it starts with, a welcome session that's anywhere from a half hour to an hour and change. Then you've got your interview or interviews that last anywhere from an hour to 3 hours. And then you've got an info session or a series of info sessions either that day or later in the week. And, obviously at least for me anyway, I found those welcome sessions all to be fairly similar in the sense that, hey, we're glad you're here. This is how the interview is going to go. Remember points X, Y, and Z specific to this interview format. And, if you stutter or stumble at any point, that's okay. Just words of encouragement. But what I found really cool was the info sessions after. I had one, I'm never going to forget this. And, should I get into this school, it very well could be where I end up. It was a session led by a number of the different deans. And one of these like mini sessions was looking specifically at how, the university supports its students financially. And so it was not just, oh, look at, our median student debt compared to the nationwide average, because anyone can do that. But this was such a well thought out presentation where, the dean walks you through, okay, take this difference, right, of how much you'd be saving by coming to school here. And I think the median, and I could be off on this, but I think if I remember correctly, he mentioned the median med school debt across the United States being somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000, somewhere in that range.
Sounds about right.
And so he said, if you just take half of that, because their big sort of recruitment tool was, how they make med school affordable.
Yeah.
And so he was saying, take $100,000. Okay. Because some people, and, I've gotten this advice in the past where people will say, dude, like, even if the school you apply to doesn't have financial aid, like, go, like, your debt evaporates when you're a doctor. And this dean said something that immediately resonated with me. He says, I don't know, what environment these people grew up in, but $100,000 is a lot of money. Like, if I don't have to pay it, I don't want to. And I'm like, that's my kind of guy.
Relatable. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I was saying, such a well thought out presentation where he walks you through what that $100,000 can turn into. For starters, $100,000 of med school debt ends up being like 180 after you pay off all the interest on it too.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you take that 100,000, or take that 180 rather, that you're going to end up paying, say you put it in like an S&P 500. That was the example this guy gave. And really smart sort of, we'll say, persuasive tool. Really, really smart approach. He was saying, in between now and the age of retirement, say you're looking at 30 years, right? If the S&P fund performs over the past 30 years, over the next 30 years, the way it has over the past 30 years, that $180,000 turns into anything from $3 to $10 million.
Oh, really? Wow. That much. I guess I don't know enough about finance, but that seems like a lot of money.
Neither did I, but I'm just like, it opens your eyes. And granted, of course, they're going to tell you that because that's what makes their school attractive in your eyes. But I think one of the things that I took away from the interview process was the quality of some of these info sessions where, and this was my first interview cycle, and I was always of the mindset that I need to sell myself to these schools. And then you get into these sessions and they're trying to sell us on them. And it's just like, this is so cool. And I think that's something that I want people to know is like, as much as you're competing for them, they're also competing for you. Right. And, not to say, wear that cape very effusively, but, just be mindful of, they need to earn your decision.
Yeah.
To some extent, not necessarily more or less than you need to earn theirs, but it is very much like speed dating where it needs to be mutual.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we'll have to have another episode in the future about how to pick a med school. And, I'm hopeful, Ahmed, that you'll have a handful of choices and you can kind of walk out your decisions, and Jaden and I will talk about ours, because I think it's easy to get caught up in trying to get in, and obviously it's a mountain of a task. But at the end of the day, a lot of us end up with multiple offers, and so then there's a whole other conversation about, what are you going to do, and how are you going to determine where it is that you want to be.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I'm just comparing. I have a twin brother as well, and he's in business, and I won't get into the specifics of what kind of job he has, because I don't really understand it very well. But he interviews for a job, and they're like, "Oh yeah, come out to across the country, and we'll pay your first class flight, and then we'll take you to dinner and put you up at the Ritz-Carlton." And so, like, it's funny to me that we're like, "Oh yeah, they give this great info session," and that's like, oh, Lord. But you're right. Like these are academic institutions, and they don't have the funding that a multi-million Fortune 500 business has, but it is nice to see, the effort that's being put out there, and that they care, and that they have an interest in, you know, for lack of a better word, convincing you that their institution is a good place to be.
Yeah,
But tell me, I'm interested to know, because I don't know if you would qualify yourself as Canadian, but you're in Canada. You've been there for a while, right? So
that's right.
you interviewed at some Canadian schools and some U.S. schools. I'd be interested to know kind of
Yeah.
what differences you noticed between the two.
So yeah, it's interesting. In Canada, so far I've only interviewed at the one school because I only applied to 4 Canadian schools. In Canada, for context, there's significantly fewer med schools than in the United States.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but in the province that I live in, there's 6. I applied to 4 in the province, and then there's a handful elsewhere in the country, but uh, can be harder to get into as an out of province applicant. And so far the one Canadian interview, compared to a handful in the US, and um, there weren't, many startling differences. I think the thing in Canada is that, at least with some of these Ontario schools, you don't really get to choose your interview time. Like, they just give you an interview date. Um, but there's communication between the schools such that there's not conflict, at least among the Ontario schools. And so they minimize your flexibility, but they minimize the overlap as well. The other thing with applications in Canada is it's not rolling. So as long as you submit before the deadline, everyone gets invited to interviews at the same time. And everyone from all med schools in the province hear back on the same day. It's like second week of May, which is actually
for interviews or for acceptances?
For acceptance. You'll interview anytime between February and end of March, usually. And then you hear back about an acceptance in early May. And so I think that's really the major difference, is just the timeline. It's a little bit later than in the US. And I was mulling this over. If I'm in a position to get accepted on both sides of the border, so for those who aren't familiar, the plan to enroll option on AMCAT, you've got to select a school and you've got to narrow your list down to 1 by April 30th. And so I could have an option in the US, but I could potentially get into a school or 2 in Canada after that point, where it changes things potentially depending on where I'm holding offers. And the other thing too is, if you're on a wait list somewhere, that really complicates things, because hypothetical where you're on a wait list at your top choice, they might give you a call 3 days before classes start. And, depending on the schools and the timelines, you might already be enrolled somewhere else. Like, one of the med schools I applied to starts in July. Another one starts mid-August. Another one starts early September. And it's like, if that early September one is the one that you're holding an offer, if the one that starts in July is where you're holding an offer at, your top choice starts in August and you're on the wait list there, you could be, 3 weeks into classes and you get a call saying, hey, we got an offer for you off of the wait list. It's like, I'm already 3 weeks into med school. Sorry.
Yeah. What happens in that instance? Are you locked into the July school?
I think, especially because, like, by that point you probably would have paid tuition.
Yeah.
So I think you're pretty set at that point. But that's
unfortunate that they don't go right ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, that's the one thing I told myself, is like, I'm not gonna worry about hypotheticals. I'm only gonna worry about what's actually in front of me. And as of right now, that's not something I have to deal with. But I've heard stories of, people, especially people who have applied to more schools than myself. Like, there's people who apply to 30, 40 med schools, and I was not one of those people. I didn't have the bandwidth to apply to that many schools, and I also didn't want to spend that much money applying. Like, between a secondary and an additional primary, you're paying like $150 a school. And like, so I didn't want to. Now, granted, in the grand scheme of things, and again, it depends on, the environment you're raised, but some people will look at, I could spend $5,000 on my application. And I was not one of those people. I was like, I'm very satisfied spending 1,000 or 1,500, whatever it was. And I was like, that's good. Because like for me, and again, everyone's mindset differs with this, but like I applied to places, as you mentioned, I was a Canadian applicant. I applied only to places that gave international students financial aid for two reasons. Number one, I don't want to pay that much money if I don't have to.
Yeah.
And number two, I think you can learn a lot about a school's acceptance or willingness to accept international students from their financial aid policy.
Sure. Yeah.
If they really wanted to bring you there and recruit you and do all this stuff, they would incentivize you to apply. But there was one school that I was considering at one point. I was like, yep, we don't offer aid to international applicants, and we need 4 years worth of tuition in an escrow account before the first day of classes. And I was just ridiculous. Like immediately off my list, like no chance. And a friend of mine applied to the same school and as a fellow Canadian and didn't realize that policy. And he was like, even if I get in, there's no chance I'm going.
Yeah.
And it's just like, but in any case, I think what I want to conclude with is, based on our experiences interviewing, what would we tell, maybe a younger version of ourselves, maybe more relevant to you, Eric, than I, because I might still be in the middle of interviewing, but, and what would we share with others? And I think a couple of things that I take away from this interview cycle. Number one is, like I mentioned earlier, understand that these people that are interviewing you are looking for reasons to accept you, not necessarily reasons to reject you, right? If a university has sent you an invite to interview, that means they've objectively decided that your application was better than others, and they're interested in learning more about you, right? And so use that to your advantage, right? Draw confidence from that. I think the other thing too, and sort of building off of what Eric said earlier with one of his stories, was you might stumble at some point in an interview. It's okay. And honestly, I think it might even be a blessing in disguise because it shows how you can handle adversity in a high stakes, high stress situation, right? And, obviously it differs by interview format. Like if it's completely async, like one of the ones I had, maybe it becomes a little bit harder to rebound because you don't have that, that human element on the other side. But I think, just have confidence knowing that these people are looking for reasons to accept you and you're there for a reason. I think going into my first interview, I think this was actually a bit of a curse in hindsight. The very first interview I got in this cycle was at one of the highest, we'll say, ranked schools I applied to. And now I do want to preface this by saying I don't really look into these rankings at all. But
yeah, I'll second that. I'll second that without going further into it right now, but
yeah,
they don't mean a lot.
And so, but like mentally, I'm like, oh crap, like this was, one of them. And I think this is a little bit different than the ranking, but like it was objectively one of, or if not the most competitive school I applied to from a standpoint of number of applications, number of interviews, number of acceptances, and then, some of their metrics like GPA median, MCAT median, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the very first interview invite and very first scheduled interview that I had. And so going into that, I'm expecting, this guy cured cancer and this guy's a Nobel laureate and, a bunch of just Ivy League valedictorians. But then I get into this and we're in this sort of Zoom conference room prior to the welcome session, and people are talking and you hear, somebody's from, Rice University in Texas and some school that I had personally never heard of in Northern New York, and a school in California that I'd also never heard of, which is saying something because I lived in California for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And then I think there was a University of Iowa, and now, granted, there were some Ivy League people in that room as well, but not to a point where I'm like, I'm out of place. And I think that, thinking back to being in that Zoom room brings up one other piece of advice, which is other people are experiencing the same stress you are and the same nerves you are. And I can say this with confidence because in that Zoom room, we're chatting as people are checking into the interview session, and like some of the things that I heard, I was like, oh, okay, like I can definitely do this. Like one person asked, has anyone ever done one of these before? And I'm like, okay, phew, all right, we're good.
Take a deep breath. Yeah.
And like, granted, I would say these are more flukes than the norm, but another person says, I don't particularly love talking about myself. So we'll see how this goes. And like saying this in the Zoom room with all the other interviewees, and I'm just in my head, I'm like, okay, not that like, and I do want to clarify, this isn't me, wishing poorly for others. This is me saying, okay, I'm not alone in being anxious.
Yeah.
I'm not alone in.
I'm not an imposter.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And like, I think after that first interview, I was able to go into later ones knowing, number one, like I said, other people have that same stress. And then number two, I'm now experienced, right? This isn't, you only have one first interview, right? And after that, regardless how it goes, there's something that you can draw from it that, can give you confidence going into future ones. And so that's those are my biggest three areas of advice: is understand that these interviewers are your advocates, right? That you're at that interview for a reason. Like somebody at that institution, or more likely a group of people, came together and said, we want this person, like we want to learn more about this person. And then understand that if you're stressed, that's okay. Pretty much everyone is. Because if you're not stressed, that means, either hats off to you, or maybe it just doesn't mean as much. Like if you think about it, if you're interviewing at a school that, regardless, you're not accepting an offer of admission, it's just, a plan Z, we'll say, you're probably not that stressed going into that interview, right? But I think just recognize that nerves mean you care, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful thoughts. I think I wholeheartedly agree. And I think it's easy to get into your own head. And so some of these thoughts about, recognizing that you're not alone and that people are kind of trying to cheer you on and looking for ways to advocate for you are important. I have a couple of thoughts as well, just some advice on interviewing. And I didn't get to talk about this much at the beginning. We were talking about the multiple mini interviews. But in med school, I did some of the multiple mini interviewing. And
oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is not my advice, but just as an aside, you talked about how you like the MMIs, and from the kind of admissions committee perspective, we really like the MMIs as well for a lot of reasons. One of which being that it kind of like diffuses responsibility and minimizes bias, right?
Right.
If you have 1-2 hour interview with one person, then it's like they either liked you or they didn't, right? But if you have, 15 5-minute interviews with people, then there's a trend's going to emerge, right? And so I think that's part of why we're kind of shifting in that direction towards having a lot of data points. But as an MMI interviewer, some of the things were like, we would do kind of like role play scenarios, or we would give someone a task to do. Sometimes we would pair up interviewees and have them do something together and see how they worked and things like that. And sometimes I would ask a question. And so my first piece of advice would be, although what we talked about, you don't have to have a canned answer for every point on your resume and things like that. I have some prepared answers, have some experiences that you can draw from. Some of these things that we talked about, like, tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in medicine? There are a million questions out there that people will say, you need to prepare for these things. But I would say those two in particular, and why our institution, those are things that you can have some answers for, because when I saw someone who was like a deer in the headlights to those things, then I'd be like, okay, these are pretty basic things. Like, you probably should have thought of this before you got in the room. You know what I mean?
And even connecting that back to, studying your primary application, like these are things that if you do want to go to this school and you do want to be a doctor, they're not going to take a lot of rehearsal, right? Like if you genuinely want to go to this school,
it's genuine. Exactly.
There's a reason, right? There's something that made you say, I want to go here, right? Now, what that reason is depends. Maybe there's a program, maybe there's a faculty member, maybe there's a financial or a geographical component, right? But there was something, right? And same thing, why medicine, right? And so definitely, that was one of the biggest things that helped me in my prep, was recognizing like, yes, these are critical questions that can be hard to answer, but ultimately, like, don't think about what is the right answer with those. Like, what is your answer?
Exactly. And we don't have to talk about this too much longer, but I will just say, sometimes it can be obvious when someone is trying to tell you what they think you want to hear, right?
Yep.
If you say why medicine, and they're well, I won't get into specifics, but there are some like very cliche things, and I agree with you. It doesn't have to be the perfect answer, but try not to go on Google and say, what should I say when they ask me why medicine? Like, just really think about it and try to be honest with yourself and genuine. If the answer is I want to make a lot of money, that's probably not a great answer. But most other things, are acceptable. And I think interviewers appreciate the honesty and genuine nature of a good and true answer.
Yeah.
So that I'll say. So have some prepared answers, I think, is one. Number two, I would say, is to just like practice talking to people, not necessarily in interview format, but like, if you're standing in line, like talk to the person next to you about what they're doing. And if you're, with a bunch of people at business school and you're not a business person, like talk to them about business things and see what they have to say. One, because it broadens your horizon and it makes you more interesting to talk to, but two, because I think it can be really intimidating to roll up to an interview and someone that you've never met and who is much more experienced than you and kind of holds the keys to your fate in their hands. And so putting yourself in kind of uncomfortable situations where you have to talk to people is really good practice. And again, it doesn't have to be an interview format, but just like getting outside of your comfort zone and having a conversation with people that you maybe wouldn't otherwise makes you a better interviewee. And outside the scope of like interviewing for medical school, it makes you a better doctor because you're going to be talking with people every day who
100%.
You may not be associating with otherwise, right? People from all walks of life. So I think that's important. Number three is similar to number two in that I would certainly practice actual interviews. And I would practice them with your friends and with your family. And I would practice them with people at the, professional development center. And I would practice them with, your dad's buddy who is, owns his own pest control business or whatever, like anyone that will sit down with you even for 5 minutes and ask you a question and give you the opportunity to answer. I think it can be valuable, just as valuable doing it on Zoom as it would be in person. I would do both, and I would give yourself those opportunities because it just makes a difference. And it sucks to do the prep and sucks to do the practice. Like, it's not fun. I don't like doing it. No one likes doing it. But it really does make a difference. I think it's hard to overstate the difference that it can make in your preparedness and in your ability to interview well.
100% echo that. Like, I got to give huge props to a buddy of mine. We played football together in high school and college, and he's now in med school. And he was a year older than me. And before this cycle, before my first interview, I was at a coffee shop. We hopped on Zoom and we went through like 4 or 5 questions, and just hearing, in hindsight, what I said, what the strengths of what I said were, what I could have done better, and just getting exposed to different question types. And I think for me, hearing feedback was the biggest thing. It wasn't just doing it, but it was having somebody who I knew cared about my well-being give me honest feedback, and like just building off that point, like don't have, a cheerleader, a metaphorical cheerleader do your interview for you. Oh, you did so good. Like, no, you need someone who, with a hawk's eye, can point out everything you could have done better, not because they want to bring you down, but because they want you to be successful. And I had a friend do that for me, and it was major. And, just absolutely echo what Eric said. Like, it's such a it's such a huge mental boost to get that dry run in a low stress setting that it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, and I said this last time that I interviewed a bunch of places and I didn't get into that many, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened. And I think we spend so much time preparing for the MCAT. This is an MCAT podcast, so we listen to the podcast and we do the practice tests and we do the reading and watch the videos, all in preparation to take the test. And then when we're, writing our personal statement or our essays, then we'll draft and redraft and have someone read them, like you said, with a hawk's eye and being critical, not sugarcoating it. We'll do all those things. And then it comes to interviewing, and maybe this isn't true for everyone, but I think for many of us, it's like, oh, I'll be fine. I have some answers.
Yeah.
I've thought about it a little bit, and I read through my CV, and I think that's where, at least I can't speak for everyone, but I think that's part of what went wrong for me, was that I took the interview lightly, and it's arguably the most important part of your application once you get to that point, right? A lot of everything else is kind of to get you in the door, and then the interview kind of is the linchpin in your application. The last thing I'll say, and this is less of advice for being a good interviewee, but more kind of in preparation for what we had talked about previously, which is trying to choose a medical school. And if you interview at, more than 4 or 5 places, or even more than 2 or 3, it's hard to keep them all separate. And it was hard when you were in person, and I imagine it's even harder when you're on Zoom. And so I would really recommend, after you do an interview, to sit down, if you have a spreadsheet with some different columns of things that you're evaluating or not, and you just write down some bulleted notes, but to say, this is how I felt. This guy gave a great, post-interview session about financial aid, and it really made me feel like they cared about me. Or these people just, they just gave me a sheet of paper and said, meet this person at this place at this time, and that's your interview, and then left us to our own devices, and it felt like they didn't care. Or, little things, or, whatever the case may be, but to write down some of the specifics, some of the thoughts and feelings that you had, and, whether or not you liked it, maybe give it a grade or something like that. But it's helpful to have at least some points that you can then go back to in 3 or 4 months when you're getting into schools and needing to make a decision. And you can say, oh yeah, when I interviewed at that place back in October and it's now April, this is what I felt like. And I really like this, or I didn't like that. Because, you can do interviews over the course of 4 or 5 or 6 months, and it can be hard to compare those things one to another. And so I think it's really important, and something that can often be overlooked, because we're just hoping to get into one school, right?
Yeah.
But I think, in case hopefully that we get into more than one school, then it's really helpful to have those notes at the end of the day to be able to determine, this is where I want to be, or how I want to do things. And this is why,
Absolutely. And to wrap things up, I think, guys, just having the confidence in yourself to know, like, hey, like, I've put in the work on my MCAT and my GPA and my extracurriculars and in my application to earn myself an interview. And you don't want to go in with the mindset of, I'm just hoping and praying to get into one, because obviously we're grateful to get in, but you need to have that confidence of, I've put myself in a strong position. This is maybe for a later date, but obviously apply to schools where you're going to be competitive. But having that confidence of, I know I'm competitive at these places, I belong at these places, like, I've earned the right to have options, and just trusting that if you do put in the work all the way through the end of the process, which, like Eric mentions, includes the interview, you're going to put yourself in a position to be able to make a decision. And to be able to make a decision is a privilege, and that's what I want for all of you guys. So keep putting in outstanding effort, and you're going to have that decision to make when it's your time. So all the best to you guys, whether you're applying this upcoming cycle and a future cycle, or you're in the current cycle, maybe just wrapping up interviews or with a few pending. Just keep that in mind. And hopefully what you heard from Eric and I today will serve you well in your med school application process, interview process, and hopefully culminate in an acceptance to medical school.